What's up, everyone? Security Unfiltered, episode 3 here. We are talking about cloud security and governance today. How you doing, Derek?
Hey Joe, I'm doing good. It's a Saturday. Getting back into the groove, and I'm feeling good.
Can't
So
complain, man. Made it through the week, I guess.
yeah, right. The weekend is a blessing.
Weekend goes by too quick.
So we got to get into those 3 day weekends when we got our consultant chops where they need to be.
Ugh,
One day, right?
man. Yeah, one can dream, right? Man. All right. So I think where we will start this off with, this is going to be a more deep dive podcast where we're diving more into cloud security, getting a little bit deep with it, talking about governance as well. We're going to do one in the future talking about how to get started in cloud security, kind of discussing how I got into cloud security and found myself in it. But this one we're going a little bit deeper. So with every cloud has five key characteristics to every cloud, and there's different risks that we have to mitigate for and adjust for with every single one of these characteristics. We have to be keeping it in mind at some point in the procurement process and some point of the architecture designs. We need to be thinking about how we're mitigating against these five different characteristics. So what are these characteristics, Derek?
Well, first and foremost, right? One of the key characteristics that organizations look to when procuring cloud services is broad network access, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that moving to the cloud, putting your applications or your services in the cloud allows, right? Is that broad network access, right? Because now that network infrastructure no longer sits in your on-prem, and so you have the ability to take advantage of gaining access through various mediums, um, and it can be done on-prem, but it's a little bit easier to do it within the cloud because of the service models, and that means that you can open it up to mobile devices like tablets, mobile phones, including your old desktops and servers and things of that sort. So with cloud services and broad network access, now you get the ability to have people connect into the cloud to get access and use those services, but from many different places using many different devices.
Yeah, I think um I think the biggest difference between the cloud and your local data center, at least in my mind, when I'm thinking of this, is um, the ability to access it uh, from anywhere. You probably can't do that with your data center, and I think that that's something to really keep in mind as well. Is how are we controlling that access, right? Where if I travel to Russia, let's say I want to go on a vacation to Russia. I shouldn't be accessing my corporate AWS account. Like, I shouldn't even have a work laptop that's capable of getting there. you know?
Yeah, if you're doing it right, right, there should be some monitoring taking place for geographical regions, for areas that are considered potentially hostile, for areas that are potentially considered higher risk, and
Russia,
yeah,
China.
yeah, and those situations, right? Consuming cloud services generally there's a geographical component, availability component, right, where they can kind of flow that data into their locations, and we'll talk about the identity and access management and some of that stuff, but let's just say it makes it a lot easier to deal with that on the front end than necessarily going through your own data center, right? Because you might have a data center in the middle of Pittsburgh, and that's where all your software and your hardware and everything really sits. And you might have a DR zone somewhere else, but then how do you make it so that when people access your product, your services on the West Coast, right, that they're actually not dealing with latency, they're not dealing with some of those things that come with having to go across the entire country, to get to your content. And that's where
Yeah.
cloud and using cloud services help, right? Because you can set up different regions and have different availability sites where your content is there, so that it can get to the end user a lot quicker and they can have a better quality of service.
Yeah, it becomes very difficult when you're trying to have a CDN like presence with an application. So, the best example that I could think of with this actually that I've run into is that, I was at a company and they wanted to make our privilege access management solution global. They wanted people in Japan to be able to, access their accounts all from one single solution, one architecture without having servers there physically for them. And there was a huge delay, gigantic delay. And, uh, to be quite honest, people didn't believe that there would be a delay. Uh, I mean, I thought that there would be a delay, obviously, but some people needed to be proven, that there was a delay. So we went through all this work and then proved, yeah, hey, guess what? There's like a 5 minute delay. It's significant. By the time they're getting access, they're timing out in the session. Like, it was craziness, you know, rather than just going from a more of a local presence with that solution. And I bring this up because the cloud really solves that issue pretty easily, actually. Um, it really doesn't take very much to solve that issue to set up like a CDN or with CloudFront or something like that and make your application global so that anyone can access it with extremely low latency. All the data is being, presented to them live. Um, and there's no delay. There's no difference between the data that they're seeing and what is actually existing. So that's a key thing that we have to keep in mind when we're going into the cloud. And another one would be rapid elasticity.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. That's where you start to think of the things that are really, the selling points, right, of moving to a cloud.
Right.
Is that rapid elasticity, right? Being able to have your services kind of burst up to meet demand, right? Especially with your patterns of business activity. If you have busy holiday seasons, if you have stuff that you do during the Super Bowl, and your site now gets a million people at once, right? Well, on-prem and that legacy model, right, is very difficult to account for some of that, right? And what the cloud does is it allows for you to actually, monitor, what's the usage on these services, on these systems, and then actually, you automate and orchestrate how these systems are being built so that it can actually make available more web servers or more databases when needed. And then that way, you don't have to worry about the infamous, DDoS that takes place when, it's just too many people actually trying to consume what you have to sell or what you have to provide, right? There's so many resources available. And when everybody is flooding to your particular site because you have an outrageous deal going on, or, somebody tweets one of your
Right.
products, and it's the right kind of, person, um, it can send a whole bunch of people to your website, to your services, and then what'll happen is that it'll be tough for that server to keep up and fetch pages and handle those sessions. So elasticity helps you in that regard, right? Because it allows for you to expand outward, or vertically when needed, so that you can meet demand, and then you can set that up to actually, monitor your resource utilization in real time and do this stuff for you, so that you don't actually have to have somebody sitting with their hands on the keyboard, pressing buttons to actually, implement or trigger these capabilities.
Yeah, and rapid elasticity also really builds into measured services or metered services. You're paying for exactly what you're using at that point in time, not a dime more. And I think that that is one of the biggest selling points for any cloud provider is that you're literally only paying for exactly what you're using. You're only paying for the bandwidth that you're using, the resources that you're using, the processors that you're using at that given minute. And that's huge because if you have a data center, you're paying for electricity, you're paying for the cooling, you're paying for the the property most likely, you're paying for, the whole infrastructure behind it. You're paying for the server, all of it. You got to pay the people. Um, with the cloud, all of that is really, kind of built into the price. You're only paying for what you use. And that's a key thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. Just one thing is to make sure that you're dialed in on what you need, right? A lot of times, a lot of organizations may just move to the cloud and think that the cloud is going to solve it for us, but you still have to do some planning, some architecture, some design, understand your patterns of business activity, and get those monitoring capabilities in place, right? So that you understand you don't want to receive a bill, right, for $10,000 more than what you were expecting because well, you never actually set up the system to actually automatically terminate when it dropped below a certain threshold of utilization. And so that's where you have to have people in there that's also cognizant that, while these things may be a part of the solution and the capabilities, you still have to have personnel within it that can actually configure it properly, right? Because a lot of
Yeah.
these things, they're not on by default, right? There used to be a situation in which a lot of storage containers and repositories would be used in cloud, but they were set to share publicly by default. And you heard of a lot of breaches, right? Where people, made the mistake of not assuming that this stuff was actually limited only to those who were giving access. No, it was public for
There's
all.
still tens of thousands of public buckets that should not
Yes.
be public.
Yeah. And so that's where you want to understand, right? Where, you have the capabilities to kind of monitor what's being accessed, what's being consumed, and then you go into, well, how do you provision these things when you need them? And that kind of leads us into, the on-demand self-service.
Right. Yeah, and if you don't think of these things, if you don't architect them out and design them from the beginning before you go into the cloud, like let's say you just got through all the contracts, you signed all the contracts, that's great. The cloud is so agile and so readily available that you go into the cloud without all that stuff. I mean, it's just right there. Anyone can do it, but you need to take the time and you have to plan. If you don't plan, you're going to get services being utilized from one team that were never approved, that are kind of grandfathered in because they were in the cloud before anyone else. And uh, you're going to run into an issue where you don't have the proper security controls around EC2 instances being deployed in AWS, for instance, or S3 buckets being deployed, for instance. And so now you have sensitive data in S3 buckets and EC2 instances that shouldn't be there, and proper security controls aren't already around it. So that is definitely something that you have to keep in mind. You have to architect and design right from the beginning. It's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And with the self-service, I kind of touched on it a little bit already, is this shadow IT presence. The CCSP calls it shadow IT, ISC squared calls it that. And that is really, since the cloud is so readily available, has broad network access, anyone can set up an account in the cloud and start using its services. And so we run into cases where, the data science team needs, these few services. And so they just spin up an account and start using those services, start putting, your company data into the cloud. And that maybe that data should or shouldn't be there, but the security controls aren't built in around it to really protect the data properly with it being in there.
Yeah, and that's where you got to have the visibility, right? Because you do want to empower departments and business units within your organization, right? I mean, if it's there, right? It's kind of like DevOps, right? If they can perform certain functions to expedite the release process and increase, bandwidth, then you want to empower them. But you still need to have visibility. You still need to have governance. You still need to have policies. You still need to have standards. And what happens a lot of times is that you'll have a department that do these things, but don't have a identity and access management provisioning, deprovisioning procedure. And
Yep.
so when people leave the organization, you realize that, well, did you guys actually go in there and disable their account? And if you don't have single sign-on in place where you can actually tie their, identity access to like Active Directory, then that can kind of propagate down. What you end up having is to have to go into many different SaaS services, right? And applications, right, to
It's
disable what,
extremely hard to manage.
yeah, disable user accounts across all these different platforms. And then the other thing is like with Joe's experiences, right, is with privilege managed accounts, right? So God forbid they're actually administrators,
Man,
right? Because if they left in a way from the organization where they have a bone to pick,
right,
well, they can still go into that account and they can make a problem for you. So
right.
yeah, you definitely want to make sure that when you do on-demand self-service, right, that your change control and your change management procedures are still in play, right? You need some visibility, whether that's a report from that group every month or something to let you
Mhm.
know and give you, visibility into the changes and who has access and when did they have access.
Yeah, visibility becomes pretty complicated with the cloud, because it's another person's computer. That's what the cloud is. It's just another person's computer that's running Linux in the background that allows you to do everything that you want to do. And when it is someone else's computer, your monitoring capabilities a lot of the times can be really limited. And so, you know, managing your identities properly from a central solution from the beginning is key. You absolutely need it. If you don't have it, you need to be moving to it, because exactly like what you said. If you have an admin that leaves and they have accounts all over the environment and they've been there for 10, 15 years and they've touched, you know, a sizable percentage of the environment, are you going to be able to track down all of the accounts that he had? Are you going to be able to track down all the access that he had? Because I guarantee you, and I know from my own experience that there was, admins at a former company that I would be at, several former companies, and they would leave, and we would have no clue where all of these accounts are. We'd be able to get some of them. We'd be able to get probably 80% of them. I would say 80, but I mean, it's the other 20 that who knows if he has a backdoor put in on that server that has a reverse, SSH tunnel going, that he just wants to get in and, mine some Bitcoin sometimes, like or extract
Yeah.
some data, and it becomes extremely difficult.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Um, and so, I guess the the underlying premise of what actually allows for organizations and consumers to actually utilize this is the idea of resource pooling, right? Because this would be incredibly expensive if
Right.
you were procuring systems for every single organization and doing physical isolation of every single aspect of the infrastructures that you're now virtualizing and abstracting into the cloud. And so that's where the idea of resource pooling comes into place. These cloud service providers have tremendous amounts of IT assets and technical assets, right? They have servers, they have databases, they have SANs, they have all
Yeah.
these things. And what actually allows for the cloud to exist is virtualization, right? Being able to say that, hey, I'll give you a portion of these resources, right? So company A, you might need 30 servers that have 4 cores and this much processors and these type of processors and run at these speeds. But if you have thousands and thousands of cores, right, then you can logically, right, give them or provision them out, and that can be what it is that allows for you to have a business model that actually has some legs. Now the issue is that how do you isolate, right, these interactions, these processes, this data stream, right? Because since the underlying technology is kind of shared resource bed, how do you ensure that company A data isn't being commingled with companies B data? How do you ensure that companies A CPU processes aren't being side channeled by company C, right? And they're getting
Yeah.
information that they normally wouldn't have seen because of some misconfiguration, right? But resource pooling in general is what kind of gives the cloud its foundation and its base, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it really drives, to the next point of capital expenditure reduction, right? So you're
Yeah.
changing the capex and the opex, and there's a lot of different cost savings with that. There's a lot of cost shifting with that. Uh, to be completely honest, I've never been a manager. I've never had to manage a budget. That's where Derek has the experience. Um, but that's what makes the cloud so tantalizing or tempting to go into. That's what makes it so lucrative. That's a better word right there.
Yeah, yeah, you shift those dollars around, right? And now
Right.
your balance statement, your bottom line, you can use some of those resources that were generally going to be attributed to, your capital expenditures and move them to operational expenses. And that's a different bucket, right? So companies are now, they have the ability to be a lot more flexible and creative when it comes to putting together some of the solutions that they need. So that's and for the most part, the cloud will reduce your technology debt and or the cost, total cost of ownership if you
Yep.
do it right,
Yeah.
right? And
You
and
have to do it right,
yeah,
right from the beginning.
if you do it right, right, there's a lot of benefits to the cloud. And I really don't see how the legacy model will be able to continue 10, 15 years in the future when you start to think about just what you will be capable of doing, even if you did a private cloud, right?
Yeah.
So it's a really good time to actually start, getting into the mindset that you want to have your skill set translatable over to cloud, because I think that this is going to be it's obviously going to be the paradigm shift. And you want to have the ability, if you're going to support databases, we'll also learn how to support them in the cloud, right?
Right.
And 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 there's a few, other little smaller things that they aren't really small, but that we can, touch on before we wrap up this particular segment, which were the key benefits and characteristics of cloud. One of which is reduction in personnel costs, right? Well, now, you get to actually leverage some of the professionals that AWS or Azure or a Google Cloud or IBM, actually have on site, right? You can actually get services where you have a managed services type of package, embedded, right?
Yeah. So you do get that. You absolutely do. There's no doubt about it. But, something to keep in mind is that when you're moving to the cloud, guess what? You need to train your people on the cloud. It's it's a totally different environment. It's something that absolutely everyone needs training in. And that's where I see a lot of companies, a lot of teams really, really fall. And they fall hard because if you don't know what you're doing in the cloud, you will really mess something up and it becomes extremely difficult to fix in the future. I was at a company where um, they had one entire environment in AWS. I mean, one entire, deployment. And uh, they figured out that due to their lack of planning and architecture and design, that they basically just had to throw away that environment and start over. I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy.
The thing about it though is that it's a lot easier to do that in the cloud, right?
Yep.
And as we touch on some of the other items, right, it kind of emboldens you to to experiment, but then at the same time, the ability to just snatch everything down and orchestrate it back up, especially if you do like IIS as code, where you're actually automatically deploying and orchestrating your networking and your systems and your services and your APIs, and you're deploying as code, right? You can get really robust systems stood up almost instantly via scripts, and that doesn't mean that now you can go into it half ass when it comes to your development and your design, right? You still need to do it appropriately.
Right.
One of the other items is transferring your regulatory costs, right? So if you work with sensitive data, say it's PCI, say it's HIPAA, say it's GPDR, CCPA, there's costs associated with that. You have to audit your controls internally. You have to do that across all aspects of your organization. But the benefits of moving to the cloud is that you can actually put some of that burden on a cloud service provider, right, to maintain that
Right.
underlying compliance. So if you go to AWS and Microsoft and GCP, you'll see that on their websites they have a compliance page that talks about what certifications they have, and we'll talk about that. We're going to get much more into that because actually ends up being a lot more important than most people think. Is that aspect of it, the legal and the compliance side? But that's there, right? You're actually able to shift some of the burden over, to the CSP.
Yeah, it's really key to um, iron out some key items when you're doing your contract negotiations um, and everything else. I felt that's where you were going with it, right, Derek? Kind of
Yeah.
leading down that road of ironing out some of these key sticking points in the contracts, the SLAs, the MSAs, all this fun stuff that everyone loves to go through.
Well, let's go ahead and switch on over to I guess what we would formalize as the second segment, which is more of you know a look at the cloud governance, right, and that legal compliance regulatory layer that sits on top. And as someone who came from the technical side, right, it can be hard sometimes to realize that there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's governing your activity on a day-to-day basis, right? Hell, business requirements, right. It's like how often do we get or understand that the business requirements are what driving our daily activities when we get projects and initiatives. So it's your business requirements, your client requirements, and your regulatory compliance and legal requirements, right? A lot of those things end up shaping what happens on a day-to-day basis in most organizations from an IT compliance, IT security perspective. But we get caught up so much in a technology that sometimes we can miss it. So I want to talk about some of those things, right? Which is the master service agreement, right? When you have a engagement with a cloud service provider, you need to make sure that you have your clauses and your provisions within there that's going to protect your organization, right? You need to be able to say where your data needs to reside, especially if you're dealing with something like HIPAA or you have clients and they don't want their data being moved over to a different geographical region that may not have laws in place that can support it.
Yeah, and you got to think about how your data is being stored. And I think one of the biggest things with discussing these contracts and all these different SLAs and MSAs, you have to think of what would you need on your side if you ever had to leave the cloud, this cloud provider. Let's say you had to leave AWS and go to Microsoft Azure, right? What would you need to protect you and your data and your customers' data in order to make that successful move and still retain ownership and
Yeah,
integrity of that data? And that is something that I think gets really overlooked. You really need to make sure that you're not selling yourself too hard on one cloud provider. You have to look out for yourself. It's not very likely. I don't think it has ever really happened where Azure or AWS or GCP have kind of held a customer's data, um, ransom or something, right? Like they held it in such a way that they couldn't they couldn't export it into a format that was usable. But you need to think of those things, and you need to have that all lined out and all written out
yeah.
in your contracts.
Vendor lock-in is a real thing.
Yeah.
And you're going to see it more so in the SaaS models, right? Because there may be proprietary algorithms or data formats in place where you're consuming that service. And you need to make sure that, your cloud service provider, enables portability, interoperability, right? The ability for you to actually get your data out, retrieve it, and make sure that in your contracts that you have, it highlighted, how much it will cost you to get all that. If you upload 3 terabytes of data to a cloud service provider and they say, well, upon termination, there's going to be a fee for every gigabyte that we
Right.
have to make back available to you, right? That can become expensive if you don't actually have it in the contract, in a way that's actually going to protect you, right? And then how long do you have, right? A lot of times, an organization needs to have their data back, or they need to know that the data was destroyed within 30 days or 60 days or 90 days due to regulatory issues, right? And so the thing about it is that as the data owner, if your data is in the cloud, you're still liable for what happens to it. So if a cloud service provider is taking their time to get you the data or get you a certificate of destruction or whatever it is, then you're still on the hook, even though that contract might have expired until you can determine that that data was properly, terminated or destroyed or crypto shred. And so you need to have it in your service level agreements. You know, uh, you need to have it in your SALs that this is the activity that the cloud service provider needs to carry out, and they need to carry out in this way with these performance standards. And then you need to have your MSA state that data cannot be transferred here or there, and your identity, and all of those other items, right? That helps protect an organization, because getting into the cloud, like Joe says, now you have people accessing your data in a multi-tenant environment where well, you may be on the hook now for threats that you didn't previously understand existed. And so it's very key that you understand, from a contractual standpoint, where all your safeguards are and where all your languages are to protect you, right? In case anything happens, if the cloud service provider isn't actually living up to your standards, they're supposed to be performing at a 80% clip. Just make up some kind of performance, right? You gotta hit 80, right? Whatever. And they're hitting the 65.
Yeah.
Well, you're paying them a certain amount of money per month or per quarter or per year, whatever way you set it up, that you need to be, and you need to have restitution, right? If they're not meeting your standards. And if
Right.
they're not going to do what they need to do in order to turn around that lack of performance, you need to have a termination clause, right? Where you can get out of that relationship, because they're going to harm your organization and your business. They're going to harm your brand, right? If the end user and the consumers are like, oh man, every time I try to log into this stupid platform, it's like giving me latency and it's dropping my connection. Well, if that's on the cloud service provider and they won't fix it, then you have to have your termination clauses and some of those things in place. And then
Man.
one of the last key things to have in place is if you're dealing with HIPAA and medical data, right? EPHI, PHI of any kind, make sure you have a BAA. A lot of cloud service providers will sign a BAA because they'll say that their systems and their environment is HIPAA compliant, but some won't. And when when that's the case, right, you need to really think long and hard about the services, the data sets, who's going to have access, et cetera. Because HIPAA, they'll come and look and they'll come and ask you, did you get a business associate agreement in place? Right? And you may not be a covered entity, right? You may perform work for a covered entity, right? You may perform services for a covered entity. So your BAA actually has to flow down to all those other organizations in which you're procuring services from them that actually may help you render your services for their covered entity. So get a business associate agreement, Azure, GCP, AWS, IBM, right? You have to have a business associate agreement in place that 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 CSP will say that, hey, we're agreeing to protect the data and the privacy and the security of this data in a way that aligns to HIPAA requirements. Because without that, you can get in a heap of trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, you can get in a little bit of trouble with that.
And those fines, man, there's a thing called, it's a negligent scale. So if you know that it has to exist and you're being negligent, right, that fine can actually be increased because you didn't do your due diligence and you
Yeah.
didn't do everything in your power, right, to kind of mitigate some of the harm that could take place in that situation. So that's kind of the contractual, look at it from the governance standpoint. And then the next standpoint we're going to kind of talk about is like the third party due diligence, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting topic, you know. As a company, we always look at these cloud providers as like the gold standard or something like that. For whatever reason, we always have that in our minds. But we still need to assess these cloud providers. We still need to hold them accountable for what they're claiming, make sure that they're not making, outrageous claims that they're providing, you know, nine nines or 11 nines of availability and they're not, because that requires them to, likely pay some money back to you or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
And
yeah.
and if your services go down and then your customer wants to get, a
Oh,
restitution, right?
yeah.
Well, it's nice to be able to go over to the CSP and say, "Hey, well, in the contract you had this, so you're going to be the ones that's kind of, funding, this restitution because, it was an agreement. We had it known." And back when cloud was first getting started, right? A lot of people were like, "I don't trust the cloud. It's somebody else's computer," like Joe said, right? It's not my computer, it's somebody else's computer.
It
I
is.
I need to be able to touch my stuff, right? Like, still don't patch, right? You can have it in your hands, in your
Right.
backpack. You can have all the
Still ain't
servers in
gonna
the
patch
world.
it.
Yeah, you can have them in your lap, like they're your favorite lap dog, and you still don't harden them. So, you know, look, the cloud, their business model is to enable business across all these different verticals, right?
Right.
Whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in finance, whether it's in banking, whether it's in just creative operations. So they take the liberty to go out and get some of these things, and we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do to assess some of these vendors, right? And one of the first things that you want to look for is like a SOC 2 type 2, right? From AICPA. A SOC 2 Type 2, it's an assessment of a service organization, more generally, usually within the cloud. And what you're looking at is, the controls and the effectiveness of the controls as it
Right.
relates to that particular service that you're consuming, right?
Yeah.
And so don't necessarily think that a SOC 2 Type 2 has, um, I would say, a full blown coverage of every single aspect of a particular organization. For example, AWS, they'll have a SOC 2 Type 2, but it doesn't apply to every single service within AWS, right? So when you get that report, you have to make sure that you look at the scope of services to understand that maybe it's, CloudFront, or maybe it's S3, or maybe it's Route 53 that's within that scope,
Mm.
because they may actually provide hundreds of services from AWS, but only 50 may be a part of that SOC 2 Type 2. So then when you're going to procure services outside of that scope, and then you get audited and they say, "Well, did you do third party due diligence against that service?" And then you hand them a report that actually doesn't have that service listed. But now you got some explaining to do, right? And so you want to understand, right, that if there's a gap there, right? Well, maybe you say it's the underlying infrastructure, right? It's the same infrastructure. And maybe they provided you a different attestation, right? They didn't have a SOC 2 Type 2 for that service, but maybe they did a cloud assessment initiative questionnaire, a cake from Cloud Security Alliance, which is very helpful, right? If you go to the Cloud Security Alliance website, there's tons of stuff there for a cloud security professional and someone getting into the cloud that lays the fundamentals across these different regulatory compliance needs, governmental needs, legal needs.
It's an
And
awesome resource.
yeah, and so I would say visit the Cloud Security Alliance, um, and look for their star registry, right? So within their star registry, cloud service providers can proactively fill out a questionnaire about what controls that their service actually aligns to, right? And the great thing about the CSA, and the cake is that it actually maps to high trust, PCI, NIST, SP 800 53, NIST CSF, high trust.
Yeah.
You can understand across all these different frameworks where that cloud service provider actually has made a statement about the effectiveness of their controls, right? And so you can look at that as somebody doing supply chain risk management or vendor due diligence and say, well, they proactively filled this out, right? So I can take a look at that and with their SOC 2, have a better understanding of their control environment. But then you use a SOC 2 Type 2, which is a third party, audit um, attestation report to get how effective they are in actually implementing those controls. And you can see the tests that were performed to ensure that those controls were actually in place and working effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, those are key resources for anyone in cloud security, anyone even looking to get into cloud security, to really learn how these assessments are done. And man, they are just invaluable. When I was studying for my CCSP, you absolutely have to know them inside and out, really have a deep understanding of what they're doing, what they're looking for, um, how it's all laid out. Those things are key to learning more about the environment that you're putting your sensitive data into.
Yeah.
That's something that you always have to be mindful of, I feel.
Yeah, I give kudos to CSA. I mean, just the resources that they have. They're kind of like OWASP in that
Isn't it a
regard.
nonprofit org?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And they work hand
Yeah.
in hand with ISC Square to actually create the latest versions of the CCSP. But they also have a CCSK, right,
Yep.
which is a certification you can take, and it's not as technical as a CCSP, right? But in terms of foundational knowledge, I wouldn't have been able. In my opinion, I wouldn't have been able to pass my CCSP without that CCSK, right? And they have a PDF that you can look at. It's version 4 now that talks about all these different aspects of cloud in a way that kind of gets you familiar with them. And then what happens that when you actually do your CCSP studies, now you're seeing it from both angles, right? So I would recommend CSA. Check it out. Many resources for cloud security. And it's great, right? Because you can get their the cloud's control matrix, which is kind of like, and people, if you haven't seen it, take a look at the high trust CSF, right? It, there are certain organizations that release control matrices. High trust is one of them. Cloud CCM is another one, right? Where man, they tell you exactly what the controls are and how it maps to all the other different frameworks. It makes your job so much easier
Yeah.
when you can say that when I implement this one control, I'm hitting that one control as it contextually applies to these 3 other frameworks. So if you actually need to get 3 other certifications, maybe you need to get PCI and a SOC 2 or a high trust, you doing one control, you actually might be applying that same safeguard or that control across 3 different certification frameworks. But if you don't know, then you may actually have people come in and redo that same work. So this helps you actually eliminate, right, having to do redundant work. You can kill 3 birds with one stone a lot of times when you have a good framework in front of you, a cross mapping that allows you to know that, oh man, we're hitting our NIST, CSF because we're doing this as it relates to high trust or whatever, right? So it's
Right.
very helpful and it's free, right? Download it, take a look at it, get familiar with it.
Yeah. And that should be involved right from the beginning of your architecture and design process. Man, when I took that CCSP, like my brain was turned to mush. I mean, everyone tells you that like, oh, if you get the CCSP, you should absolutely just go and take the time to get the CCSK. My brain was gone, dude. It was like I passed that thing
Yeah.
and I was like, man, like I felt like I couldn't do anything for a month that was difficult. Like,
I did it after 3 days. I sucked it up because they said, "Hey, get back on it," right? Because like I felt like you did, right? You feel so like um
relieved.
relieved, right? Yeah, and it drains you of all your energy. You're like, "Oh my goodness, I'm glad I'm done with that."
I mean,
Like,
you're studying for so long. You're
yeah,
doing. I mean, it's an everyday thing for
yeah.
2 to 4 hours. It's just like, oh my god, I don't have to read that book no more. I don't have to watch these Udemy courses no more.
Yeah, it definitely
Oh
is.
man,
I don't flaw anybody who said, "Hey, I'm done with this. I need a break." Right. I can always come back to this. And that's the one good thing about the CCSK is that, you take that test, it was always a web-based test anyway. So you can take it at home, right? You didn't have
yeah,
to go into a proctor. a place like Prometric or like some of the other ones. I can't remember the
Pearson
names of
View.
some. Yeah, Pearson View, and whatever. So you can take the CCSK at home when you're feeling like you're ready for it. And I think it was around 110, 150 around the time that I took it, and they had some kind of like discount if you needed to take it again. So just check it out. And I guess we can kind of move into one of the like main, the last key, items that we can kind of talk about in this segment, which is like risk management, right? Because you could talk about controls all day, right? Um,
I know you can.
yeah, right.
This
I can talk about controls all day,
is your bread and butter.
right? Oh, but the idea that just because you're compliant means that you've eliminated threats or risk, right? And that's where things can kind of get dicey, right? Because the thing is that you can be compliant but have crappy security.
Yeah.
Now, now,
Yeah.
what would lead
You
to
can
that?
check that box, but your
Yeah,
data still may not be encrypted properly.
yeah,
You may not
exactly.
have the proper IAM controls around it.
Exactly. And so, there's still the idea of understanding who your threats are, right? Who's actually trying to attack your organization? Are they a script kiddie? Are they financially, motivated? Are they a state sponsored actor? Maybe they're a a a a justice organization that thinks that you shouldn't be selling hamburgers. Whatever it is, right? You're going to have particular threats that come at you, and the resources that they have at their disposal changes the amount of threat that they can pose to your organization, right?
Yeah.
Because a state sponsor actor may sit on your organization for a year, 2 years trying to get
Unlimited
into it.
resources.
Yeah, they wake up every day, they stretch in the morning, and they got your organization pinned up on a wall,
They
right?
got 3 shifts of people that are just focused on your org. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it's you're you're not gonna win.
yeah. You're not. They have more resources, they have more dedication,
And
right?
more of everything.
Yeah, and so you need to understand when you're up against somebody like that, right? In that case, do you have a web server that's has struts vulnerability on it, and you leave it open even though it's been called out for months?
Like,
You know, do you leave repositories of source code unmonitored in some fashion where an
with access
organization,
keys in them,
yeah, and they can
not
sit in your
not to
network.
mention a recent breach.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy, right? So the thing is that you want to do risk management, and so there's two groups that can help you kind of expedite that process, which is a ANISA, which is a European Union agency for cybersecurity, right? They actually create a risk management for cloud security guide that talks about some of the top threats and risk um, for cloud service providers, right? And one of the first ones they list is vendor lock in, right? Like, do not lock into a vendor and not be able to leave. Because at that point, if that vendor goes under, guess what's going to happen to your that service, right? What if they get bought out and the new group that buys them out says that we don't want to deal with this anymore. We're going to go ahead and get rid of this service. Or what happens if it's proprietary, formats for your data sources, right? So vendor lock-in is a real thing. So check out Anisa. They actually talk about things like multi-tenant isolation and physical isolation failure, misconfigurations of interfaces, etc. Right, and then the other one again comes from our good friends, Cloud Security Alliance, and it's a series that they started releasing back in 2013. And the first one was called the Notorious Nine. So think of like the OWASP top 10, right? And how that comes out every couple of years. Well, the
Yeah,
Notorious Nine were like the top nine threats, risk um, to cloud service providers or cloud services. And what it does is it highlights some of those things that actually are being leveraged to actually breach or compromise cloud service providers, right? And it came out with a treacherous 12 in 2016, and the latest one was the egregious 11 in 2019. But take a look at that. Between that, Anissa, and your risk management program, right? You can get a lot of high level risk and get visibility into them and know that, well, if we're going to get breached, if we're going to have misconfigurations, if we're going to have all this, at least this gives us the ability to assess at a high level very rapidly, what our posture is, probably before you even move to the cloud. And then you can kind of worry about some of the other threats like insider threats and all of that, as you kind of, develop your program and mature it.
Right. I don't think I don't think I could add anything of value that you didn't already say to that.
Well, you know what? I think
I
it's
mean, you go
time.
deep with it, man.
I think it's time that we go ahead and we talk a little bit about the security operations within the cloud.
Mm.
And these are some of the items, Joe, because I believe you took the AWS or you were studying for that, right? That security exam.
Yep,
And
I took it. I passed it
yeah, and so
somehow.
how do you feel about identity and access management and cloud authentication? Like
I mean, yeah, man. When we're talking about security in the cloud, right? I mean, you have to I would say there's 2 or 3 major areas that you have to address right off the bat. And it is security of your pipelines, how people are able to access your cloud environment, how they're able to spin up resources and whatnot. Securing those pipelines are absolutely key. And then once we have that down, in conjunction with that, we want a strong IAM least privilege approach uh, to to everything that we're doing in the environment. We want to make sure that you're not over provisioned, that you're not over permissioning. Just because you can't get something to work right doesn't mean that they need global admin in the cloud or anything like that. But you know what? I've also been in situations where organizations don't want to give their resources the proper rights. Like they literally hire people, and until you do your time, and I do mean years in time, until you do your time, you don't get access to resources in the cloud, to just like the security hub, for instance, or the Azure Security Center. You don't get access to it to do your job in the cloud. So you're paid to sit there, do your time, and someday you're going to get access. I've literally been in a situation where a server was breached. There was malware on a server and it was actively being exploited. And I wasn't allowed to remediate it because I didn't do my time. How insane is that? And I'm sitting here, I'm the only one certified in the cloud, and I don't have access to it because of some internal politics.
politics will destroy incident response probably quicker than any other issue that can arise when you have competent people that can actually jump in.
It'll destroy your workforce. Who wants to work there? Who wants to do that job? I mean, really, like, you know what? I guess all right, I guess if I was at the end of my career and all I wanted to do was just ride it out until I retired. Yeah, perfect environment. Wonderful. That's great. I'm not making any headway in my career. I'm not making any changes in the industry. I'm not really participating in industry functions. I'm not enriching myself or anyone else. Yeah, I'm just going to sit there. I'm going to collect my paycheck. I'm going to go off into retirement and then live a life, outside of retirement, right? Like, and that's far too common at some companies. Like they don't push you to be any better. But that's for a different podcast.
Yeah, that's leadership right there. And that's coming soon.
Yeah, right. So, the third area, once you have IAM, properly implemented and you have the proper, controls in place or privileges around that, you need to be thinking about how you're encrypting your data, and not just about how you're encrypting your data, but where you're storing those encryption keys, where you're actually storing them. Because the keys that you're using to encrypt your data, it sounds very simple, but the keys that you use to encrypt your data should actually never touch your cloud provider.
Yeah.
If anything, there should be a copy of them on prem somewhere that you have in a very secure location. And then you could even have a backup or maybe even the real deal in another cloud provider that actually doesn't encrypt anything over there. I've heard of companies literally having, their entire environment in AWS and then all of their encryption keys are in Azure. And that's all that Azure does. It literally just stores their, 15, 20 keys that they need to keep their environment up and running and encrypted and everything. And that's how you're supposed to be doing it. Encryption in the cloud is more critical than ever. And if you don't have encryption, if you're not protecting your data properly, then you're spelling that disaster. You're waiting for disaster to happen. And everything is compounded when you don't have proper encryption, when you don't have proper access controls in place. You know, these things are key. And when you don't have proper pipeline security, you have to have your pipelines secured. You can't be having your developers spin up 100 public S3 buckets, or EC2 instances that have access from the internet on port 22. Why 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 would that ever be allowed?
Yeah,
It's
it's where again that just because you move to the cloud, you can't diminish the value of your
right.
security team.
And I watched, um I think it was the Senate, um the deposition of like big tech the other day, and they were talking to Jeff Bezos about other companies using AWS, and then AWS somehow getting access to their data, their own, designs and architecture for their own companies, data that they're making money off of, that they're basing their company around. And then AWS basically creating a competitor that is exactly like them, like the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And the only thing that comes to my mind is, one, how did they protect their data? Was it encrypted? Probably not. And if it was, they probably stored the encryption keys in AWS. I mean, that's encryption in AWS. I mean, in any cloud provider is paramount. I mean, it's so many issues and risks get compounded upon when you don't have it.
You know, there's three different, encryption, I guess, um, values that most people look at, right? It's encryption at rest, encryption in transit, and encryption in use. Well, almost none of the regulatory requirements that I'm familiar with really harp on in use. So what
It's
ha-
so new, no one really has it.
so what happens is that you may have things on encrypted storage, but when their CPUs are processing it, it's being processed in the clear. And so a lot of times you'll see in contracts where you have to specifically ask, what metadata are you taking from the data we provide you? Because a lot of services and applications that you leverage, I can guarantee you they're processing your information and they're creating reports about usage.
Yeah.
And what happens is that a lot of times you might use a service provider and they want to get into that space. So what they'll do is allow for you to consume their cloud service provider infrastructure, and they'll give you a deal, right? Well, why? Because they're going to process terabytes of your information on a day-to-day basis
Right.
and learn every single thing about the way you operate. And then they're going to come out with a competitor down the line and you're going to be up against them. And it was because, some of those things that they can utilize, which is, getting metadata, sharing that metadata to some of their third party subservice providers, right? And for them, they'll create reports and understand more and more about your product and what you provide as a service. And you may see situations kind of arise where, yeah, now there's a knockoff, and you kind of you let them in, right? You
Yeah.
let them in, And so that's one of those things that you have to be very cognizant of, especially as Joe mentions, like with the encryption, right? Because there's a whole team of engineers that sits on the other side that have access to the hypervisors, right? Where are your images stored, right?
Right. Right.
Who's patching your images a lot of times? Because when you have infrastructure as a service, well, the cloud service provider has certain responsibilities and the cloud consumer has certain responsibilities. Well, sometimes the cloud service provider is the one that's in charge of handling everything from the physical up to the OS layer. And then this cloud consumer takes everything from the OS layer and out. So pretty much they'll put the applications on, but they're not responsible for the configuration of the OS or the configuration of the hypervisor. So you'll
Right.
have situations in which somebody can get access to your hypervisor where you have 30, 40, 50 production servers and they can have a password that they've been using for 15 years because they just keep going into their platform and keep resetting it every time it needs to be changed, right? Who has governance over that, right? And that's where you have to get your due diligence and your reports right, because you're opening yourself up now to not just what can be misconfigured or abused within your organization, but
Right.
also the organization that you're leveraging and
Right.
their supply chain.
Right. It's crazy. It's it's crazy. When I saw the deposition last night, I was just like, "What?" Like, I know it's in the contracts. I know it's not supposed to be, a thing, but you know what? Like they harp on with these ISC square boot camps and whatnot. Man, like just because it's in that contract does not mean that you are fully protected with that. You still need some security controls
Yeah.
around your stuff. You still need to be doing your own due diligence because
Yep.
I mean, what if that's HIPAA data and it's not encrypted, but it's in a secured location in the cloud or something, maybe it is even encrypted and you stored your encryption keys in the cloud, and now AWS is using that data to go and create another product with it. I mean, I don't want to harp on AWS. I
Yeah.
apologize. I've been
Yeah.
in AWS the past like 2 years just nonstop. So AWS is the first cloud provider and the last one that I think of when,
Yeah.
when
No.
I'm
Yeah.
thinking of these topics.
It's just an example. We're not casting any shadows on any of it, but it is
Yeah.
something that we have to look out for, right? And I've seen situations in which I've been asked to review contracts, and it get bogs down on the definition of metadata, and that would be the topic literally that's causing a delay, right? And it'll go for months. It will be
Yeah.
one word in one sentence, and they're like, define this, right?
Yeah.
Define it, because a lot of stuff can be abstracted from it, and it just has importance. So just keep your data lifecycle management right within the cloud is important. So just understand how you're sharing that, who has access to it, when, etc. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that was a pretty good pass at talking a little bit about some of these high levels cloud security concepts. There's so much more, right? You can get into the
There's so much more to
architecture.
all this. I
Yeah,
mean, we didn't even talk about containers.
yeah, containers and all of that. So the idea though is just to give you guys a primer, because people who want to get in the cloud security space, where are you going to
These are the
bring?
things that you need to know,
Yeah,
that you kind of you really got to get acquainted with them, right? Like that's why we did this episode this way, because these are like really kind of the basics before we even start talking about what certs to get and how to start studying for
yeah.
them and things like that. You need to get your mind kind of wrapped around and geared towards the cloud. Like I always found it more helpful when I could get my mind in the right perspective to start engaging with this information to learn it better.
Yeah. And on that note, Um, I got two shout outs real quick. One is to the cybersecurity Reddit.
You
Uh,
guys are awesome.
yeah, we see the questions that's in there. Been checking out, Reddit and cybersecurity for a long time. So, appreciate the support that was given when we kind of, let it be known that we were creating this podcast to do certain things. So, we look forward to being able to interact with you guys and get ideas about what we can do to help, some of you guys, move through your career. And
Right.
Paul was one of the guys who reached out to me from Reddit, and he let me know that my menu was clipping on my website. So when he was trying to navigate my website on mobile, he would hit the menu button, but my post would actually lay on top of the menu.
Oh
S-
man.
So he said, "Hey, you got this issue," and I'm like, "Okay, thanks." And I got my CCS, my CSS auditing on and editing on at night, and fixed the Z index issue with that. So appreciate that, Paul.
That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, before we close, we now have a YouTube channel. So if you really want to see our faces and not just our beautiful voices, you can go on our YouTube channel. It's just Security Unfiltered Podcast. Go ahead and give us a subscribe, leave a comment, leave a like, share it. You know, we each have our own blogs. Joe Security blog, and what's yours? Tech Jacks.
Yeah, techjacks.net.
Yeah. So thanks, guys, for listening. We really appreciate all the support. We are going to be pumping out this content as quickly as we can. We both wear so many different hats in life, and we're just working on scheduling this in, getting in that rhythm of building out this great podcast, is producing great content for all you guys. So we really appreciate all the support. Thank you, guys. That's all that we have for today in this episode. Thanks.